everybody, my name is Marilia Mello. I'll be hosting this fireside chat with Melissa and Andrew. And to start, I actually want to ask you all who are here today, how many of you do already have an SRE team in your company? Please raise your hand.
Okay.
I see all the Googlers raising their hands. Stop that.
And how many of you are actually thinking about starting a new SRE team or hiring for your own already existing SRE team?
Cool.
Okay, cool. So we'll be talking here today about how to start an SRE and also how to hire SREs and other questions, okay? This is open to questions from you as well. I do have a few questions that I'll be starting with, but we'll have time for you to make questions as well, so please start thinking about that. If I don't cover the questions here, please raise your hand and you're gonna give you the mic as well, okay? Cool, so the first question I have on here, which is probably a challenging one, is how do I know when my org needs an SRE team? So what justifies for me an SRE team? What issues exist and what are the potential benefits?
You want to start?
Sure. So the question is, how do I know when I need an SRE team? Andrew and I decided ahead of time I would take this sort of big company, and he would take kind of the small company perspective, so you'll get both. From a big company perspective, what we're looking at is, if you have an SRE team, how do you know when to make an additional SRE team or shard off to a new org? And there's sort of two things we look at. You're looking for technology and focus that is similar. So I was involved in the creation of GCP SRE, and we split it off from our internal tech infra SRE teams. And we did that because we saw that there was actually a critical difference between interacting with external customers and the concerns that external customers had about how we handled our SLOs, how we handled our responses, that differed from how we did internal software. And trying to combine the two in one focus just wasn't actually giving us the amount of leadership bandwidth that we needed. So splitting that off helped us service, you folks much better, and allowed our internal teams to really be able to focus on what they cared most about, which was the capacity and efficiency focus. The other thing to do is to look at your dev partners. You want to have an organization generally that aligns at least somewhat with them. And when you have one sort of focus covering a large dev swath, they may not be getting the kind of partnership they're looking for. So that was the other thing that we did, was we were able to then just split up our dev VPs across the two of us and get sort of better coordination with the dev teams, better depth of knowledge, and better alignment with the business.
So I'm going to take the more of a historical, how would you seed your first SRE team from Google's basis? Show of hands here, how many people have gone from and are currently from 0 to 1 SRE teams, or are just about to go to their first? Okay, so in Google's history, SRE was formed because there was, out of all of the broad general software engineering roles, there were several people who had self-identified and kind of clustered around the production boundary, the production interface. They were literally called production team. And it was interesting because it wasn't the production ops team or what have you. It was the software engineers most production curious, as it were. And I think it was a very important and I think accidentally insightful thing that Google did, which was they said, we recognize this boundary and we want to support it. So take a look around. Humans are curious creatures, and they'll tend to just do what they want to do within reason. See if you can encourage and seed, may I suggest, an SRE team from the general traditional engineering side with those most production adjacent in order to keep that engineering aspect from day one.
I often describe it as you're looking for the folks who are more interested in the activities around the software than in chewing out lines of code themselves. And I suspect this applies to a bunch of folks here because you're all here. But the people who get really annoyed when you have a bunch of bugs that are out of date, or your CI/CD pipeline isn't working right, or your pushes keep stalling. And it's not that you don't like writing code, but you keep being attracted to solve those problems around the software, not just in the software.
Yeah. So maybe an indicative sign of this is, like we were saying, is if you are here, how many of your colleagues at any level of your organization would also like to be here right now? Is it more than 2? you probably have a nascent SRE team already happening. You should just fund it.
Awesome. I think we started to talk a little bit about the next question as well. So we have 2 or 3 people, and plus 2 people that want to do this SRE thing. So we have an SRE team. It's a buzzword recently, right? SRE. So we created an SRE team, but we're not really sure what it should be doing. So in reality, what is the SRE team doing? And then we can either split in the startup versus big as well.
Okay, so side note, forgive me if I'm all hyperbole laden and come to Candy Mountain about this. I spent a lot of my time doing college and industry recruiting for SREs to come to Google, so naturally I'm biased and excited about this. But the way I try to explain the role of an SRE is it's really like whether or not you buy into the whole left brain, right brain sort of thing. I'm going to instead say it's like 2 halves of the brain are proactive and reactive, right? Yes, of course, there's the carry the pager, the react to various things, the vigilance and the diligence type stuff. This is all well and good, but there's also this very much a always be prepared within reason, proportionately, within proportionate reason sort of way. What I mean is, having the regular conversations in your team, the disaster drills, the let's think about the best and worst that could happen type stuff. So it's an equal balance, right? You want to be there at the earliest part of the design phase in order to be able to make the subtle improvements from the experience and the gravitas that you and SRE has had for years from doing this sort of thing to influence and make sure that the error bars on a launch of something that has been designed, X months ago aren't very large, right? Like the biggest non-event of the summer should be the launch of said product or project that you were involved in. So I'm looking for folks who are good engineers but also good reverse engineers, which is something sometimes we forget to think about, right? I'm not necessarily saying it should be a bunch of, IT jockeys who question authority and always like to break their alarm clocks open to figure out how they work, or any variant of that. What I'm thinking about is people who are inquisitive, people who are analytical, people who want to understand a whole system. And that can come from either software engineering and or IT and ops, right? It's a spectrum. These are the sorts of things I look for in the fellow folks that I bring into an SRE organization.
And I want to expand on that. It is dangerously easy to develop a monoculture in your SRE team based on the values of the person who is most influential, which might be the start or the first manager or the leader, whatever. If that person is highly biased towards very often reactive stuff, you can get an SRE team that is going to double down way too much on being excited by incidents and way too little on long-term planning. If the person happens to actually be like a frustrated software engineer who would be rather writing code, but got told they're not good enough, so they have to be an SRE, by the way, that's terrible, don't do that.
Horrible.
But you're going to get a team that is constantly like railing against wanting to do features on the product instead of doing automation code. So a really critical thing is to think through all the different SRE is an incredibly multidisciplinary activity. You need people who are good at deep software debugging. You need people who are good at understanding distributed systems. You need people who are good at understanding the ways your infrastructure can go wrong. There's so many different aspects of it. Then you get the immediate versus the long-term, the break fix, the designs. You want as diverse intellectually a crew as you can.
Yes.
If you're interviewing someone who is completely unlike you but interested in it, that's a really good sign. And focusing on that when building your team, drawing from as diverse a background and diverse in every possible way that you can, you will build a much stronger team at the end. Because everyone can learn how to answer a pager, but having people who are interested in the long term, people who are interested in the short term. I mean, we have some SREs who, like, their most exciting moment is when we declare a Google-wide incident and they get to be at command of the helm of, like, getting a whole bunch of people to respond to something. Like, I've watched those folks. I'm not those people. My interest is really on the product side and how do I make customers as happy as we possibly can. And then I have some colleagues who are so deep into the hardware and the optimizations and what performance can we eke out of this. But all of us together are what make SRE great. Any one over-indexed would not produce a good team.
In this aspect, how do we actually prioritize the activities that the SRE should be doing? For example, should we be focusing on emergency response? Should we be focusing on the dashboards, the monitoring? How is that conversation like to focus on the activities that they will be doing?
I think it really depends on the size and the trajectory of the team, because a very well-tenured fully fleshed out sort of team, I think will have a different resting set of ratios. And also, I don't think that every single person on the SRE team will have the exact same set of interests. So you afford the luxury of being able to kind of load balance from within once you get to a series of stable engagements, a relatively well-known space, but still a lot of change in the velocity of the individual products. When you start, and by the way, I have my own set of opinions on like the minimum spanning set of SREs, like best SRE anti-pattern I've ever seen is we're going to hire one person and they're going to work all of the SREs. That's called a scapegoat reliability engineer, and that's how you do your SRE org. We can go in more into what not to do later, but like essentially, let's say you have a minimum set of people who are all very new to the role, who are trying to kind of get up to speed. There's a lot of like running to get in front of the treadmill / people mover that may happen, but it's how you do it, I think that's most important, that will afford you the ability to get to a point, like I mentioned previously. I don't know, let's...
How to prioritize the activities the SRE team will be doing?
I don't have much to add to what Andrew said, other than to answer a slightly different aspect of it, which is that I would simply encourage you to make sure you are actually prioritizing. Because it's very easy to not prioritize and to have the sort of urgent always trump the important. One of the ways I like to talk about this is in terms of budgets, where you say, okay, we are planning on having 20% of our team's energy going towards working with the devs on new products, 50% of our team's energy going towards doing automation on the stuff we've already onboarded and math, 30% of our team's energy going towards operational issues. And then actually test that that's true, and when it's not, stop and think. Is this really actually the thing to do, or are you just reacting? Like I have SRE teams tell me they can't possibly tell their devs that they cannot spend only 20% of their time on new products. I'm like, well, have you tried? Because it actually turns out to work surprisingly well. People understand the concept of budgets. They understand I have a lot of things to do and this is how I'm prioritizing things. So that's one of my favorite ways to handle is with buckets.
Nice. And you talk a little bit about what I'm going to ask next. Again, thank you. So how should the SRE teams build their relationships with the developers in the company?
I think it's a matter of mutual respect at all times. So, for example, here's a couple of anti-patterns. I'm going to come in and you've got velocity and you've got reliability, and they're 180 degrees out of phase with each other, right? Wrong, but okay. So what's the best way to increase our stability? Fire all the humans. Stop making changes, right? Like that is the best way to quickly reduce yourselves to the exaggeration of a strictly only ops organization.
It's amazing how stable your system is over the winter holidays.
Yeah, right, exactly. Let's just freeze all the time. So the way I like to pitch the value of SRE to any dev team that I work with is we want to be there from day one with you, or we've got your back, and vice versa. I also want to explain, like the way I talk with my hands a lot, I try to make it maximally orthogonal, the relationship between velocity and stability. Because how many people here learned to drive an automobile in a car that had like a driver's ed person in the passenger seat? And had like maybe they had a brake, right? So if your dev organization perceives you as the driver ed instructor with the brake, you're doing it wrong. If they perceive you as the weird person riding shotgun with you that has an extra accelerator pedal, you're probably doing it way better. Right? I will often work with my dev teams to say, how can we go faster? I'm going to write the automation, I'm going to write the safe guardrails to make it so that we can decouple some of the scariness from this. We'll make things auto rollback. We'll figure out ways to do experiments. We'll segment stuff. We will, one cherry-picked CL will not tank the whole release. We'll be able to march forward and backward on our features, promoting the most reliable ones, those sorts of things. So if you get into a shouting match, if you get into a post-mortem I'm going to point at someone I know in the audience, it's a blame exercise because they know that they can take it, right? Like that's bad. It really should be, I've saved your butt several times over, and we've made this faster together. We've saved each other's butts. I think that's really good. If you start off from an adversarial relationship, there is no way, in my opinion, from having looked at this time and time again, to somehow, it's not like you can flip like binary bit overflow and suddenly you're back around to respect, right? You have to start from we're here together. And sometimes that comes structurally, like you're forged from the same fire, but from different VPs. It's very rarely from someone screwed up and now we're going to replace them with the people who are mystical and magical and misunderstood, or the people who are adversarial. There's really a set of fine balance. And if you don't check in all the time and communicate, that will go off the rails just automatically.
Yeah.
There's a couple of failure modes I've seen that SREs can take deep offense to and not realize that it's just the devs not always thinking things through. Probably the prime one is just going off what you said at the end, is that SREs are magical unicorns. Unicorns. In terms of the devs, like I've had a dev say this to me, that they couldn't possibly take on this project, and I said, why not? And they said, well, we don't know anything about the code. And I'm like, literally, what do you do for a job, dude? I mean, I'm sorry, but like we take on code we don't know all the time, so can you. And so, but you don't, it is easy for an SRE team to fall into kind of a blame game and a pointing there and say that all the devs do is throw stuff over the wall. You have to kind of sit down and tell them when that's happening and say, hey, like, this isn't okay, can we talk about this? Decently often you're having an SRE team evolving out of an ops team, and you have a lot of habits, you have a lot of things you're accepting, and it can be very dangerous for SRE to take a very adversarial stance, as Andrew mentioned, from day one, as opposed to sort of sitting down and working out some new relationships and then having some agreements that, hey, when things go off the rails, we're going to talk about it, we're going to fix it. I had one other thing I was going to say. What was it?
I can actually ask specifically to your experience, because when you started GCP SRE, the devs were already there, right? So you brought in the SREs. Is there any specific things that you did to make sure that the SREs and devs
yes, I'll change that very slightly, which is that we actually hired a lot of, GCP has grown so incredibly fast, thank you all for buying it, that we have hired a large number of executives from outside Google. So in areas of Google that have grown more slowly, it's a very organic, the VPs kind of get beaten into shape by their peers and they cooperate a little bit more with SRE. That is less true in GCP. And my job for a while was literally educator of VPs. And there's like this like kind of class of VPs that I taught all of them. One of the key things that we have, though, in our toolbox at Google that I think isn't always common outside, that helps with this adversarial relationship, is the ability to politely and calmly walk away. The handing back of the pager. And that's something that I get people asking me, like I'll go and do customer meetings and, like the head of ops will pull me aside and go, no, really, can you actually do that? Like, have you? I'm like, yeah, I've actually, not me personally, but I have had a conversation with devs. I've had one conversation where I said, your service is bad and I am losing SREs and I'm not going to block their transfer. When this team gets too low, we're going to have no choice. Would you like to change course now? Spoiler, they did. And I've had other teams where we've sat down and we've had like months-long conversation of, is this a healthy relationship? Is this something we should continue? And the thing is that having that position to take is both a relief valve for SRE, because you don't need to drive it to the point of adversarialness, but it's also a really good sort of early warning discussion with your devs. But to have that, you need a culture where it's okay for devs to be on call.
Yes.
And that is a very hard conversation in some companies. Depending on where you come from, that's either natural or incredibly insane. Feel free to tell them that at Google, all the devs, even the ones with SREs, are actually expected to be able to be on call.
Yep.
So we do shared on call. Like most of my teams, the devs will answer pages during the day and SRE takes them overnight and after hours. So, you can use my name. Because often, Google doesn't know we do.
Yeah.
But you need those escape valves, because at the end of the day, as much as we want to say partnership, just like how QA tends to get the short end of the stick because they're the end of the development cycle, SRE can very easily get the short end of the stick if you have not put in some rails to help with the power imbalance.
may I underscore this particular phenomenon? And it is, of course, the thought exercise to you as to how this may or may not apply at your own company. At Google, let's just say that there are about 80,000 or 60,000 engineer-shaped people. There are 2,886 as of yesterday SREs at the company. So think about that ratio, right? 2-point mumble to 60. So SRE are a scarce resource. We're really hard to hire for. That also means we go where the action is. And so, working backwards from that, at Google, most software engineers on most projects that are not search, ads, Chrome, apps, et cetera, or the cream of the crop revenue-wise thereof.
GCP.
Right? GCP, forgive me, sorry. No. GCP happened after my time. Hello, everyone. Most things that launch at Google never get an SRE. Most things that launch at Google that do get an SRE don't get an SRE team, mind you, like 2 continents, minimum of 6 people in each team, SRE team. Some of them, it will take quarters or years. And so by the time SRE gets to the regular stable on call with it, golly gosh, it's a really well-maintainable system because the people who are in charge of adding features and potentially operational burden to it have had to deal with it. So on the flip side, right, I hate to use the word leverage because it sounds like I'm spouting out some Harvard Business Review nonsense, but the real leverage here is if your ops team already has 100% of the on-call, where can they go from there? And that may be what a lot of people are thinking here. Here's a real quick one. Maybe not all new launches abruptly, but the mid-tier or long-tail launches don't have SREs on them. And that's not meant to be punitive. That's meant to be, we're focusing this, again, at the risk of mysticism or SRE or this weird thing that's bad too. SRE being attached to a project, being there, we're here to help. This is a sign of focus. This is a sign of enthusiasm, of skill above and beyond that is necessary. So you want to work with SREs as opposed to, I want to add one more project. What's one more project, Toad says, as we add more pagers to the ops team. That's so incredibly different. And you can iterate towards that while maintaining that leverage, respect, scarcity.
And if you're thinking about that, I did see enough nods that I'm going to do this quick follow-up. Realize that the deeper in your stack something is, paradoxically, the more important it is to have SRE on it. Your leaf node, the stuff that your customers actually interact with, that's probably pretty simple stuff, and when it goes down, it doesn't affect other things. Your database, your pub sub services, your everything else in that big infrastructure layer, that's where the danger is, because the blast radius when those things go out and the complexity when those things go out is much higher. So a good place to start is where if you have a devs launching a new service or a new feature that's gaining adoption, that is a good place to say, hey, why don't you guys support that until it gets big? And we're happy to help you. We're happy to figure out, how to improve it, what monitoring you need, but why don't you guys handle it at the start?
So we talked about how the relationship of SREs and devs are, and we also started talking about how the relationship of SREs and the business owners or the product team, because they are the ones actually going to decide where the SREs are going. Is that right?
So the question is towards how should SRE relate with product deciders,
Yes.
As opposed to maybe feature engineering designers.
Right. So how is the relationship between the teams that need SREs and how do they request that to the product team?
Yes. So that is one of the other things that we do, because as Andrew said, we don't want SREs to be, so it turns out the way humans work is that if I give you something for free, you do not care at all about it. And if I charge you a penny, you suddenly care way more than 1 penny's worth. And so we actually treat SREs similarly. When you're looking at your headcount as a VP is the sum of the SREs on your product plus your engineers. SREs come out of the same pool. So if you're not willing to staff SRE enough, SRE will not take on your service. But when you do, that counts against your product. And that puts your skin in the game, and that makes you, you are literally and deliberately trading off engineers, software engineers, for, I call it myself, software engineers for SREs, very deliberately, and while at Google we do report through separate management chains that we have the ability to escalate and to say no, which we also think is critical. But like that's a very tight partnership. And what part of your question did I miss? Maybe Andrew can cover what I missed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mutual exclusivity of staffing, right? What do you mean I'm melting down a dev to get an SRE? If only it was fungible like that, is actually really, I think, important. Other than that, really.
Oh, I remember what I wanted to say. Sorry, Andrew.
Please.
SREs should be doing work that SREs uniquely can do the best. So if your SREs are writing features for your dev product, that's not something SREs can uniquely do the best. The idea is that you're staffing appropriately. So your SRE team is the size to get the most out of that. And if you actually move that back into the dev team, you'd probably have to put more people on it. But simultaneously, if you put too much headcount into the SRE team such that they're flowing over and writing dev features, they're going to be less efficient at it because that's not their specialization, that's not their passion.
Though that being said, encouraging cross-pollination and rotations, like being able to say, I'm the grand poobah of, $ company. I hereby pre-authorize that, anyone with a quarter's notice can spend 6 months going to either team from either team in order to build empathy. Shocking, right? And breadth. Amazing.
We actually financially incentivize our devs to spend 6 months with SRE, and it's brilliant, and an awfully large number of them convert to SRE.
More than 50%. So it's billed as a catch and release program, but it's actually more of a Hotel California. And they want to stay with us, which is great.
So from all you were talking, it seems like SRE is not only taking the pager and looking at monitors. It seems there is a lot of culture related to that. And then you have an interesting title as like SRE culture lead.
Yes.
What does that mean? What is the SRE culture involves?
I don't know what it means either, but I'm about to find out. No. So I spent 12 years on call for all the different facets of Google search, which was a fascinating and wild ride. And then for the co-current with that for the last 4 years, up until basically a month ago, I was also the co-founder and pretty significant designer of a lot of the orientation programs for all new SREs. So I've done the hiring, I've done the training, I've done the panicked one-on-ones in the night, career existential angst. I've done it all with many people in the SRE organization. And I think SRE has a lot of, SRE as a concept, and Google SRE as is applied, has some really fascinating things to it. I think there are things we do really well. But there are now, in our company, there are 240 something SRE teams, divide by 2 because we're paired over continents. That's a lot of different ways of rolling the dice and trying out different ways of doing things. Even just things like weekly disaster drills, or how every single dev SRE partnership is designed. Like, I can give you an answer and it might be representative, but chances are there's a lot of variance. So I'm actually going around and visiting teams 1 week at a time to cross-pollinate a lot of this stuff. I think a lot of it is, to me, to typify the SRE personality. I won't, because there are multiple personalities, but the set of personalities is inquisitiveness, the ability to circumvent hierarchy in order to put the user first. That sounds like a lot of corp speak. Let me try this again. Realizing where the rubber meets the road, that you may be the most decisive person in the room, and then encouraging people to take that on. Like, case in point, what I have told every single new SRE that has started at our company is, when you are on call and you get paged, you are hereby officially VP worth of authority for your product in the moment. Because don't worry, it's only several $1,000s a second, right? We give you great responsibility and trust. SRE is a mesh, not a tree, when it comes to solving our systems, because our systems are distributed systems. Our systems aren't pointy-haired boss under pointy-haired boss under pointy-haired boss trees, right? No offense, right? So we need folks who can think like a mesh. It all kind of comes into that. And so I think our culture is trust each other, support each other. It's not all hold hands and kumbaya, but it is, it's radial, it's mesh, it's not a tree, both technologically and people-wise.
I want to expand on that just a little bit.
Please.
Andrew, as always, is spot on, and I have little to say. But
Too kind.
When I was considering coming to Google, I had a friend who is the director of all of our network and traffic stuff, everything. I was utterly amazed that he went on call and utterly terrified of the prospect and could not believe it, thought he was like God among men. And I started at Google, and I went through one of the very early SRE EDUs, which is where I met.
I'm glad I didn't damage you. Everything worked out great.
And I saw the level of support, the level of tooling, the level of camaraderie, and the level of trust and acceptance. And I told him I had no more respect for him anymore because I saw how much help he had. But it actually took a lot of the scary and the mystery out of it. And one of the things I value most about SRE at Google, because I work with a lot of dev teams, we are probably one of the most diverse orgs I work with. And I think that's because to work here, you have to be open to new ideas. To work in SRE, you have to be open to new ideas, to different ways of thinking, and you have to be able to support each other and work together. Blameless postmortems only work when you can actually pull off blameless with a straight face and mean it. And to have a culture to enforce that kind of thing, like you really need to keep on it and to not tolerate people who are going to perturb that. Like, you need to be much more careful caretakers of not hiring jerks, of getting rid of people who can't work with people like them, because this is a high stress role once in a while. And then, you're not on call again, but like every moment of on call could explode into google.com is down. And no one wants to be the reason that search is down. Although, Andrew, didn't you take search down once?
I did.
Yes,
and my
excellent.
team bought a bag of, did you know for $100 you can get a shredded, decirculated pile of $100,000 from the Treasury Department? And my team once awarded me with a bag of shredded money with a Post-it note on it with the location of the cluster that I had borked rather considerably. And that was when I knew I was one of the cool kids, because I wrote the postmortem. We found out some really interesting things about the actions that I did and their ramifications thereof that we now use as part of our proper reactive procedures, right? I was like, maybe this will work, bam. Oh, it made it worse. Cool, but now we know, right? And that would never have happened on many other types of dev and IT ops type relationships.
So think about the type of environment you need to build for that to be actually true to everyone's core.
Yeah.
That to me is what SRE culture is, and that's the only way you can survive. Because if you have hiding, if you have finger pointing, if you have jerks on your team, that's going to come out sometime and hit prod. And
Or that you'll take it out on your devs in the same way. You'll just start projecting, right?
Yeah. So I have only one more question before we open the mic, so please prepare your questions. And maybe it's the challenged one, but how do you define success of an SRE team?
I had a really good answer for this like 44 minutes ago.
Well, I want to underscore a point you made earlier around if you were to release the headcount behind the SRE team back to the suite team, that it would, the software engineer team, that it would take more. There's a sense of we are working on the most important things at the hot gooey center of our product, right? We are where the rubber meets the road. We are at the interface of the system and the user. It's how many people here have seen Tron, the original movie, right? That's Tron. They fight for the user. Like SRE, Tron, very similar.
I'm a manager, so I have a little bit more quantitative answer.
Fine.
But you can pick from between us. For me, it's that your SLOs. If you don't know what an SLO is, please talk to someone from CRE. That your SLOs actually are user-centric, that your SLOs actually reflect the user experience, not what you were able to measure, not what was easy. That your team is spending at least half their time doing enduring work. That doesn't necessarily mean writing code, but it means you're doing work that is going to continue to provide value at least 6 months into the future. That's my best definition of engineering work that I can come up with. I think it's really critical that, you're not just patching things and calling it code. Look, it's not toil because I wrote code. Well, if it's throwaway work, it's still not enduring. And that you have an appropriate relationship with your dev team. It is possible to be too chummy with your dev team. I don't know if you guys know the phrase captured regulators, but I've seen SREs who will bend over backwards to justify ignoring the fact that they went out of error budget because they have forgotten that part of their job is, I like to describe it as, you are the insurance policy that you took out for yourself for the future when you were about to make a bad decision. And that's what things like error budgets and SRE help for, is we say, hey, in the calm times, we all agreed we would freeze in this situation. And now we really want to get this release out, and we know the customers want it, but we're out of our budget, and. Well, what do the customers think? Do they actually value this more than the risk of additional outages? And so it is very easy for SREs to get caught up in that, because they do. You want a good relationship with the dev team, but you also need to have a foot outside the world at the same time. And obviously, bad would be being the other way.
To this point, another thought exercise, right? I talked about scarcity. Like, to me, the successful SRE team is the SRE team that every dev team wishes they could work with. Not because it's, here's a black hole I can throw my pages into, ha ha ha. Because in that case, if you were to say at your company gathering, raise your hand if you want an SRE team, and if everyone raises their hand and snickers a little bit, that's not good. So here's an exercise, right? Maybe this will work for you, maybe it won't. To your dev teams, ask, if you had an SRE team that you were working with, what would you work on together, right? And if the answer is, all the bad stuff, right? Like, this interface to apply for the honor of being able to work with an SRE team. It's the weirdest of things, right? It's again, to the consumer electronics marketing technique of a 1 cent costs so much more than 0 cents. But then also, on the flip side, right? Take all of the answers to this ingestion survey and take it to your fledgling new SRE team and say, which of these answers do you think is actually right? And if the SRE team then says, oh, the ones that said we get to work on tickets all day, right? That's also bad, right? It should probably be somewhere in the middle, where if you as the arbiter of who gets to work, who gets staffed to what, says, I can see we want to reward the right sets of matches, where the SRE team says, we want to extend and make this product launch faster. We want to stay up less at night for all of us. And if the dev team says, we'd really like to get some hard critique of our systems so that we don't launch in a fiery ball of doom later, like, all of that is good. But you can imagine the cross product of all of the bad. Maybe try that out, see what happens.
Can I add one thing that's not what you asked?
Of course.
Okay. This is something I want to make sure I say, and I think just in case it doesn't come up in the question. I'm not a big fan of methodologies that require 100% adherence to be true. So any kind of purity tests or whatever of that. And I have heard when talking with people, sometimes people seeing the SRE book as essentially a purity test. You have to do all of these things in this or you're not an SRE. And I love a story that I will tell that I usually don't tell to anywhere near this large an audience, of an L6 engineer who showed up at stand-up one day right after the SRE book was released.
An L6 meaning relatively senior.
I'm sorry, staff engineer, yeah, like one level above senior. And he shows up with the SRE book in hand and he says, hey guys, I read this really cool book over the weekend, maybe we should do some things in it. Even at Google, every team doesn't do everything. And we do things different ways, and we pick and we choose what's important to us and what's important to our service. The kind of one sort of central tenet that I see about SRE is the understanding of incentives and the understanding of the value of engineering. If you're understanding how you and your dev team have aligned incentives and you're making agreements ahead of time, whatever those are, and if you're making sure that your team is doing engineering work, all of the rest are things that you may use to get into that place or to get better. But please don't think that if you're not doing Wheel of Misfortune, you're not doing SRE, or if you don't have, actually the CRE folks would probably tell you that error budgets and SLOs have to be on that list. Yeah, David's here, I'm getting lots of nods from CRE. All right, add that to the third one. But, yeah, thank you, David. But, like, you don't have to do everything. You don't have to do everything from the start, and pick and choose what works for you and your company culture. Like, it's a cool area. This is something unlike anything else we do, and it's an opportunity for those of us who love infrastructure and who love the stuff around software to be able to have this as a career. And it's a very exciting time.
Yeah. And the word asymptotic really applies here, right? You want to make a large leap away from a traditional or stale or practice of 10 years ago type situation of devs and ops. You want to make a large stride, a very strong foray into that, and then ease off and ease off and ease off as you get closer to some sort of theoretical limit. Many companies I've talked to have said, well, we're going to try like one little thing and see how that works. I'm going to be the only person here who's going to tell you that's not going to work. Everyone else here is going to be like, yeah, come talk to us more about this, and the first hit is free. Like, if you just say, well, we're just going to make this one little incremental thing, it's not going to work and you're wasting your time. Okay? So I'll be the bad cop here. But now, for everyone here who is nice cop and would love to tell you more about how we can work together to do this, because I'm sure you have lots of questions, and we're going to answer a lot of them up here on stage, but for the extra ones after this, would you please raise your hand if you're a CRE or you're a dyed-in-the-world Google SRE here who would love to answer questions? Look around and find the face of the next person with their hand raised.